critical face-to-face talks to try to end the war with Iran are now just one day away. Vice President Vance just left for Pakistan, where he will lead the U.S. delegation for this administration's third attempt at forging a deal with Iran. Now, the pause in fighting that set up these negotiations is just a couple of days old and already teetering due to Israel's continued bombardment of Lebanon and the virtual standstill in the Strait of Hormuz. Those complicating factors and more are now on the VP's plate. And we have new reporting about the precarious position President Trump has put him in as a once vocal critic of exactly this type of U.S. military venture. Let's discuss with MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai, our White House reporter Jake Traylor in Washington, and MS Now international affairs analyst, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. So, Jake, you have some great behind-the-scenes details about this decision to have VP Vance lead these talks. Take us through it.
Yeah, Anna, it's really interesting, and essentially the tightrope is a great way to describe what Vice President Vance is doing right now inside the White House. He, for years, has been the leading dissenter on any type of military foreign involvement, especially inside this White House. Now he is headed to Pakistan to be the chief lead negotiator for a war he never wanted in the first place, and that has come at a cost. I spoke with multiple White House officials inside the White House and also former White House officials that have worked with Vance closely before. One person told me that, quote, Vance's national security team is extremely weary right now, trying to publicly portray support for the president and the war that he has started, but also privately having deep concern for the war itself. Another White House official told me that, quote, realistically, Vance has lost clout within the White House because of his dissent. So there's been a lack of influence that White House officials are telling me Vance has right now, even though he is ultimately the lead negotiator in this moment. And another official highlighted how different this looks in a Trump White House, especially in a second term, as opposed to his first or another president altogether. They told me that normally whenever there's a voice of dissent or someone who maybe disagrees in a situation room, that would help lead to a greater outcome, some nuance, some context that would ultimately lead the president to make the wisest decision possible. They said in this White House, that actually looks quite different. They said, quote, 7 years ago, you would have had a lot more outspoken voices referencing the war. This time around, that's not the case. Vance privately, sometimes quietly voiced some of that concern, but ultimately he's still the one leading the negotiations, and so it's going to make for a really pivotal moment come Saturday.
Ambassador, obviously the Iranians know what the vice president has said, his public positions when it comes to foreign involvement. And twice before, U.S. negotiations with Iran have ended in surprise attacks by Israel and the U.S. Given this slight shakeup in who the White House is sending with Vance added to the mix, what does that signal now to the Iranian delegation?
Well, first on our side, I just want to underscore how unusual it is that the vice president of the United States of America is leading a foreign negotiation. Nobody from the State Department is there. That's usually the job of the Secretary of State. Sometimes none of the specialists on Iran, to the best of my knowledge, are part of this negotiation. Mr. Witkoff and Kushner, I guess, are there, but they haven't been very successful in negotiating with the Russians, I would just underscore. So it's unusual on our side. But from the Iranian perspective, it means that we're taking it very seriously, that we're sending the vice president to negotiate. And I think that makes their situation easier. I think that gives them leverage that we look like we're so desperate for a deal.
Inzamam, on the eve of these talks, is there any more clarity about the potential terms and on the status of the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, Anna, I've been speaking to the Pakistanis today, and they seem very positive. They seem very hopeful, as they would. They are the ones mediating these talks. They're the host nation, so they want it to go well. There has been, following on from Jake's reporting, there has been some big question marks over whether Iran will actually attend. I do think that they will follow through. But there has, it seems, been some disagreements amongst the senior leadership inside of Iran. But one source inside Tehran, a foreign diplomat source, telling me today that everything seems to be on track to go ahead. This source added that these talks were meant to be about how to work towards a permanent ceasefire following the initial 2-week pause in fighting and opening up of the Strait of Hormuz. But the issue of Lebanon and the waterway are two gigantic tasks that need to be resolved immediately. So a lot of the focus will be on that. So clearly, this source telling me that those two elements, Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz, is what will be discussed initially before they go on to have any permanent ceasefire conversations. On the point of the Strait of Hormuz, Anna, there are still around 800 or so vessels parked up at the entrance of that waterway to pass through. Only one oil tanker managed to go through in the last 24 hours, which tells you that Iran still very much is controlling that waterway, and there is no real sign of an uptick in traffic across that waterway. Iran really seems to be taking advantage of controlling it economically as well. We've heard multiple times that they've said that they will charge a toll for ships to pass through. And then overnight, we actually heard, well, didn't hear directly, but read posts from the Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei. We have not seen him since his father was killed in the first few days of this conflict, remember. And he said that we will definitely take the management of the Strait of Hormuz to a new phase. So I think clearly in any permanent peace talks that may take place this weekend, the Strait of Hormuz and how Iran wants to run it and control it will be very high on their agenda. I don't think that will be received well by the United States or, in fact, the Gulf states, who are here effectively on the sideline and will be watching carefully what happens this weekend. But those 2 points clearly will be the talking point, Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz, Anna.
Right, and with that strait essentially closed off still to so much traffic, the whole global economy is impacted. And Ambassador, new data out this morning shows inflation and energy costs are surging here in the U.S., adding to the pressure on President Trump. He told NBC News he's very optimistic about a deal with Iran. He says Iran's leaders talk much differently when you're in a meeting than they do to the press. They're much more reasonable, he says. Do you believe the U.S. has reason to be so optimistic? And what do you think it could take to convince Iran to release its stranglehold on the strait?
Well, first, I have no idea what basis the president is making that assessment on. He makes it sound like he's been talking directly to the Iranians. There's no evidence that he has, that they're more reasonable and rational. That's just a metaphor for him from Venezuela. I think that Iranian experts are very divided on that. But the biggest thing that you're talking about is what we're trying to correct that we created. I want everybody to remember the Strait of Hormuz was open before this war, and now that it is the main talking point of the ceasefire negotiations, that is a giant victory for the Iranians. And I hope it will not be the case that somehow Tehran will control that Strait of Hormuz. But if they do, and they're charging, that is a huge setback for American national interests, for the interests of the world. It sets a horrible precedent that you can now charge to go through straits like this. And to add to that, when the president said we're going to do a joint venture with this despotic regime in Tehran and we're going to make money there too, that would even be, in my view, a much further setback. So I hope that's not true. I hope it's just pre-positioning. But right now, it sounds like a very dire situation. That's the negotiation. And they're not talking about nuclear weapons program. They're not talking about free and fair elections in Iran. They're talking about what Tehran wants to talk about.
There are many more problems that have now become part of these discussions than what were the original pieces of the negotiations ahead of this war with Iran. Ambassador, you have President Trump saying that Iran's public message is very different than the private message. We know senior leaders are reportedly having trouble coordinating with each other after several of the top hierarchy were killed. And then on the U.S. side, you have President Trump, who is known to change things on a whim. So I wonder, for a negotiator in the room, how do you determine you're getting the accurate official line?
I think it's very difficult on both sides, as you just pointed out. Who is these reasonable Iranians? We don't really know who's in charge, who's sending the negotiating instructions to the people in the room. That's very unclear right now. And on our side, to your point, the vice president, I think, very strategically said, the president has given us clear negotiating orders, right? He wants to make sure that whatever he does there is on the president. But as you just pointed out, the president changes his mind virtually every day. He's been all over the place on what are the objectives of this war. And I don't think that's going to change in the near future.
Meantime, Jake, next week, the State Department will host a trilateral meeting on Israel-Lebanon negotiations. But Israel continues its attacks on Lebanon even after agreeing to talk. So what is the administration's position on that?
Yeah, well, it's been a bit back and forth. Initially, whenever the loose, shaky ceasefire, we'll call it, was decided upon, that included the entire Middle Eastern region, which, of course, included Lebanon. It's been reported that President Trump was aware of that. Then there was a phone call of sorts with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where it seems that the president's messaging and understanding of Lebanon being a part of that was then excluded. We heard from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and J.D. Vance, who both said that Lebanon was never included in the first place, which is different than some of the reporting that we've seen. Iran, of course, says that Lebanon was a part of it. Pakistan, who mediated this shaky ceasefire, also said that Lebanon was a part of the conversation. All of this just underscores how much of a gap there is in conversations and negotiations that are going to take place on Saturday, and how much of a moment this is for Vance to secure what exactly and who are the nations and the countries and the regions that are protected under this ceasefire, Anna.